Thanks very much, Kingsley. First of all, I'd like to say I thoroughly enjoyed yesterday's presentations, and particularly interesting, some of the innovation that we're starting to talk about. And talking about the restoration economy, I think two spaces which are important for us moving forward. Anyway, it brings me to our first speaker today, Bruce Pascoe. Bruce has published and edited many Australian short stories and novels. He's also been the winner of many literature awards, and he's currently in the running and shortlisted in Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales Premier's Awards. He's a board member of the Aboriginal Corporation for Languages, lives in East Gippsland. He's also been involved in the movie, the film Black Chook, which was filmed in 2015 and starred Brendan Cowell, Ian Davies and Lynette Curran. Please welcome Bruce to the podium to do his presentation, Slow Food, the Arc of Taste. Thanks very much, Bruce.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the people of this wonderful country and all elders in the room and those who are no longer with us. I'm a Bunurong, Tasmanian, Punna, and Yuin man from Yuin from South Coast, New South Wales. I live on the very south end of the border of Yuin people. And thank you very much for having me present at such an important conference. When we're talking about the world and looking after the world, it is an Aboriginal concept, looking after Mother Earth, because the mother is the absolute centre of all Aboriginal belief. Nothing comes before it. When we're involved in this task of looking after the earth, restoring the earth, we are sometimes tempted to despair, but if you have children or grandchildren, then it's impossible to do that, because then you're condemning your children to a hopeless life. So you have to find hope, and you might find it in unlikely places, like the Courier Mail. In today's edition of the Courier Mail, it informed us that some of the biggest corporations in the land, Woolworths, Officeworks, people like that, are banning single-use plastics in the near future. That would have seemed impossible even 2 years ago, but because it's in the Courier Mail, you can believe it. It is going to happen, and that's not the only thing we want to happen, but it's a surprising outcome for me, because I didn't think we would see that in a decade, let alone the coming year. It's a terrible shame that we invent things and accept things without properly testing them. The fact that many fish in the oceans are ingesting more plastic than they are food is a terrible outcome for science. Science is ingenious, but it has no self-control, because the humans are tempted to believe that they are God and that anything they do is okay by the earth. But we need to remember that we're just a tiny speck in the system of the world, and that our role there is to look after the world, not to make it into something else. Statistics like the fact that 30% of Australian reef fish disappeared in a decade are likely to make us despair, but as I mentioned before, we can't afford to do that. We always have to keep working. We have to find ways of encouraging the rest of the world to look more gently at their world. I've been trying for 7 years to get the organisations which are supposed to be supporting Aboriginal people and Aboriginal entrepreneurship to support a local community in gaining land so that we could grow our own food, the food that I'll talk about shortly. I reckon I made about 30 submissions to various organisations, sometimes to the same organisation 4 or 5 times without any success at all. Eventually I bought the land myself, and I bought an old rundown farm that had been heavily stocked, completely overstocked, and the previous owner of that farm had whatever piece of plastic he owned, he left on the ground. Cattle tags, hay bands, you name it, it was still there, blowing around on the farm. And I've spent the last 3 months walking around with a plastic bag, collecting plastic. But it's just indicative of our attitude to our world, that in a beautiful place like that where I live, you can take half a dozen screws out of a plastic packet and throw it on the ground. And you know, you're the owner of cattle. You know, what are you thinking? Where this material is around, you're on the bank of one of the more pristine rivers in Australia. Any high wind is going to deposit that plastic in the water. What are you thinking? We have to be more considerate of the mother, Mother Earth. Binyajan nalo bidang nujan jungurung. We rise from the mother's heartbeat is the statement that we say every morning on the south coast, just to remind us that we come from the mother. I wrote a book called Dark Emu, which was written out of despair because I couldn't read a history of Australia that talked about my own people, my own family, and I thought I was going to be writing a book about a few facts as soon as I started scratching the surface, and I began scratching that surface because I was told by some of Australia's preeminent historians and archaeologists that what I was talking about, that Aboriginal people had a food industry, was nonsense, and that I was misleading students by tempting them to think that Aboriginal people had an agricultural economy. And that was very fortunate because it made me even more determined to do research which a novelist, which is what I am, would not normally do. So in that research I was turning up information that astounded me. I thought I had half an idea of the agricultural and primary industry economy of Aboriginal Australia, but I was wrong. Every explorer's journal, explorers in inverted commas, every explorer's journal I turned to showed that that explorer had witnessed Aboriginal people engaged in agriculture or aquaculture or both. Christian worlds, that is Europe, when they began exploring the rest of the world, they went there not to engage with the indigenous inhabitants. They went there to dominate them and to take their land. You know, all kinds of sophistry might have been used to explain why they had to be there, but basically they were there to take the land. And the Pope at the time made a papal bull, which was that called the Doctrine of Discovery, 1493, which was produced in response to Columbus's ventures in the Americas. And the whole propaganda behind it was that the Indigenous peoples of the world were not using their land, so therefore Europe had to have it. This painting, which was pretty ubiquitous in my childhood, which is a hell of a long time ago, but it explains that the leopard and the lamb shall lie down together with the kid and the calf, and the young lion and the fatling, and they shall be led from the wilderness by a young child. And I just accepted that as a Christian truism until I realised that in the bottom left-hand corner of that, underneath that arch, this is First Nation America. There are some American Indians talking with William Penn. And they're not talking about the weather. What they're talking about is William Penn taking their land. And this is the kind of excuse-making that the Christian world went on with. I was delivering a keynote similar to this at an environment conference in Canberra, and on the back wall was this map, and it says, "Breathes there a man with soul so dead, who never to himself had said, 'This is my own, my native land.'" And this is a map of London. So the people of London were talking about their land in these terms, and yet quite happy to take someone else's land. This is a very important photograph. This is a tool amongst thousands of almost identical tools in the Australian Museum in Sydney. It had never been displayed. And yet, of all those tools, this is virtually the only one with a tag, and it says Bogan River Pick. This was collected by an early entrant into the lands of those people on the Queensland-New South Wales border. And Jonathan Jones, who's an artist and like me, a novelist, shouldn't be involving himself in any of this business, examined that stone amongst the other stones and found that the point had never been used on wood, never been used on stone, it had only ever been used on soil. So what is an Australian Aboriginal person using a soil turning tool for? This had a right angle handle attached to it, and it was used for chipping out weeds in crops. So the people were managing the land of Australia using agricultural tools. There's another one that I found in Daylesford a few days after I received that first photograph, because I doubted the word of my brother, Jonathan Jones, a Wiradjuri man. I thought, you know, he sent me this, it's a momentous occasion, I love the photograph, but can I test it? Because it's science, can I test it? And so I was working in Daylesford, I went to the local museum, I found a glass case, and it was labelled Stones of Unknown Use. And there were several of these. They were all hafted, that is, they'd had handles attached to them, they were all soil turning tools. And this map is really important for us here, because this was compiled by the Rural Industries Research Council based on the work of Norman Tyndale. And Tyndale was an American who was, by the time he'd finished in Australia, was being lampooned by his fellow Australian archaeologists as the Mad Yank, because he was interested in Aboriginal people. And he was interested in the fact that Aboriginal people, according to him, appeared to have been here a very, very long time and appeared to be doing unusual things. The dotted line, which incorporates the shaded area, is Tyndale's version of where Aboriginal people were growing and harvesting grain in Australia. So it incorporates the grey area, which is the current Australian wheat belt, and quadruples the amount of land available for grain growing at the contact period. We now know, of course, that that area takes in the area numbered 3 and 4. So it's a massive area of Australia. We're growing, our people were growing grain on sand with only the available water and only the available nutrients for them. Of course, the yields weren't as great as wheat, but we were growing food in the desert. Those places which we now call the dead heart of Australia. In a drying continent, in a drying world, where water will become a premium, growing food on sand is a good trick and is very kind to the earth, because we're not demanding more and more water, we're not demanding more and more nutrients, and we're using land that Aboriginal people had managed for 100,000 years for that purpose. Kangaroo grass occurs virtually right around Australia in one form or another. It is the staple of many unimproved native pastures, and superphosphate kills it. So if you're looking for it, look for the places where superphosphate hasn't been used, which not too many of them around, but it'll be growing there. And the cattle love it. If you have a kangaroo grass in a corner of the paddock and you open the gate to cattle or horses, they will gallop to the kangaroo grass first. This is an indication that they know what is good for them. And this is a very difficult grain to mill. I've ground this into flour, and it makes a beautiful bread, but it is very difficult to work with. Why would Aboriginal people have chosen this grass amongst the 300 or 400 grasses in Australia? They chose it because it was so good for us. This is a plant which we'll be seeing more of. It has an enormous root mass, and that root mass is also very deep. So it's accessing moisture at very low levels in the soil. Its root system has a positive impact on the soil, as does Murnong, which I'll be talking about later on. These are Australian plants. They actually want to grow here. They're not like wheat, where we have to add water, add fertiliser, spray them with pesticide, mollycoddle them because they come from a different hemisphere. This is an Australian plant. What an incredibly radical thing to do, to start growing Australian plants for food. And not bush tomato, not kakadu plum, not the things that I call condiments, although they're wonderful plants and we should honour them and we should be using them, we should be eating them, which we're doing. But turn to these plants, which are the staple plants of our continent, the staple foods of Aboriginal people. And I believe the reason we haven't talked about them in the past is they talk about possession of the land. Now, it is a political statement. I was going to say it wasn't, but no, it is a political statement. But the reason is it's not just a political statement, it's an environmental statement, because these are perennial plants. You don't have to plough the land, you don't have to irrigate, you don't have to poison, you don't have to over-fertilise so that fertiliser gets into the rivers. This plant is an Australian plant which is perennial, which is good for the soil. These things are important for our land. We harvested kangaroo grass. We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years. We started off with hand harvest. We've now got a machine harvest, and this is not kangaroo grass here. This is Panicum decompositum. We're grinding that into flour in that photo to make bread. And the interesting thing about the photograph is the sand behind it is where the grain grew. This is Lake Mungo. Very, very dry country, and yet it produced this food which made this bread. The only reason I got this in there is because they're my kids. And I'm very proud of them because they've helped me a lot to produce harvests like this one here. And I took this photograph, that's why it's out of focus, and it's a very important photograph because it's part of an old grinding dish. And I was very excited by that grinding dish because it was found to have starch in it that was 35,000 years old, which made that the first time in the world that people had ground grain into flour to produce bread. So the woman who used that grinding dish was the world's first baker. So I thought, until excavation at Kakadu showed us that there was a grinding dish there that was 65,000 years old. Once again, the importance of this for us is that it shows the great tradition of using Australian plants to make food in conditions which our European-style farming can't abide. This is one of the Aboriginal workers at the Australian Museum who was standing by a stone from her own country. So she has her hand near a stone which it is more than likely that one of her relatives used. This is, Bill Gamage sent me that photograph of a painting because in the background you see Murnong growing. The painting is called The Coming of Cattle to Kangatong in Western District, Victoria, very soon after the city of Melbourne was built. So even when those first cattle arrived, Murnong was still being grown by Aboriginal people. Not as a monoculture, because we now know that Murnong was also grown with bulbine lily and moth orchid. And a friend of mine, Louise Crisp, I don't know if anyone knows Louise, a botanist, has found a section in the Western District where all those three plants are growing. This is the yellow plain that Sir Thomas Mitchell saw growing when he first ventured onto Australia Felix. And Mitchell said that the whole plain, stretching as far as he could see in either direction, was yellow from yellow flowers. And he thought God had done it. Mitchell said, God has produced this so I can find it. I thought Donald Trump had an ego, but Mitchell was pretty good. But no, it wasn't God. It was Aboriginal people who had produced that bounty. And if you read Bill Gamage's book about the biggest estate on earth, Gamage talks about some of the richest soils in Australia having the fewest trees, which is the reverse of what you would expect, because Aboriginal people had been growing food on them. And the Western Plains of Victoria are exactly like that in Mitchell's observation, because the very best soil, probably in the country, had the fewest trees. And a lot of my friends, you know, I belong to a large number of environmental societies, orchid societies, things like that, and a lot of my best and dearest friends throw up their hands when I say that, because they said, oh no, we want more trees, we want more trees. You know, the world doesn't have enough trees. Well, what the world doesn't have enough of is big trees. We're cutting down the big trees. Aboriginal people had an environment where there were massive trees, but on some parts of the country there weren't many of them because they had removed them in order to grow food. Some of my friends find that difficult to swallow because they like the Australian wilderness. There was no such thing as wilderness because Aboriginal people knew every corner of it and used a fair bit of it. This is Murnong, Microceros lanceolata. A bush rat walked past strawberries to make those tooth marks on the middle tuber. This is a plant that will be eating out of Woolworths, won't be wrapped in plastic. And the same with the breads. Bakers are already begging for flour that we can't give them because we don't have enough seed, but these are plants of the future. This plant, when you grow it, over a period of years, turns the soil into powder. And this is what Europeans first witnessed in Melbourne, that you could run your fingers through the soil. It was that the tilth of it was that soft. And there's some kind of chemical reaction between this plant and the soil, but there's also the aspect of repetitive tilling and harvesting, which was going on. And it's a very important plant. Apart from Beth Gott, the botanist at La Trobe University, we would know nothing about it, apart from Aboriginal knowledge and public record from the contact period. Beth is a champion and virtually unrecognised. This is a type of Murnong that a friend of mine introduced me to in the back of Canberra last year. It's an alpine version of the Murnong. We don't think it's been described so far, but the Murnong produces a tiny tuber, you can see by the scale of that photograph, but it is 7 times as nutritious as a potato. So you don't need to eat a lot of it, and we eat far too much as a people. So to get our nutrient from less food is going to be a valuable thing. There's Beth, a fabulous woman and a fabulous scientist and a great Australian. There's my son's Murnong garden, and this is that 3 years later, that whole area is now a mat of green. It was built on kikuyu, and that mat of green is preventing the kikuyu coming through, so it's its own weed mat now. These are the fish traps at Brewarrina, part of aquaculture, which I can't talk to you about. Surprising photographs coming from your country, talking about an aquaculture system. These are our houses, these are our burial, these more houses, and that's the bread. And these are the ancient breads. This is one of the reasons why I started to pursue all these plants. This is pottery, that's a chook, and that's a book. But the importance of this for the conference, and I hope I haven't deviated too far away from the theme, is that we're talking about Australian plants that have become acclimatised to our country and have been used by Aboriginal people for 100,000 years in an environmentally sustainable way. And we may be talking about transforming Australian agriculture, and people kind of grimace when I say it because it seems impossible. Well, in the last 6 months, most of the people that I've been speaking to are Australian farmers, and they are clamouring for seed because they're going broke. Not all of them are doing this for environmental reasons. Some of them are doing it because they are going broke. And the only way they can see of saving their farm is growing a plant that they don't have to water. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for a very informative presentation. I was going to ask you a question which I think you answered right at the end, was what do you believe the potential markets for native grasses are? And I think you probably covered it off at the end with some of the farmers approaching it at this point in time. Has anyone from the floor got a question they'd like to ask? Someone got a microphone?
Yeah, go on, shout, mate.
Just wondering what the potential is for scaling up the agriculture. I mean, obviously, you're trying to think at small scale. Do you see that there's potential to scale these things up? Are there people that are interested in partnering up and facilitating research to see how this can scale up?
Yeah, we're very early stages of it, but we are hoping to scale up the whole production of these things. The hardest thing, it's not the science of it, it's not the agricultural science of it that is the difficult thing, because we can grow these plants, we know that. We can grow them in small plots, we know that we can expand outwards. The most difficult thing of all is to ensure that Aboriginal people are part of the industry. These are beautiful plants. They're going to be great for Australia. People are going to make millions of dollars out of them. But the most difficult thing for me is to make sure that some of our young people, young Aboriginal people, are part of the industry. We can't stop, and we don't want to stop, the rest of Australia being involved, because it's important for the environment, it's important for the country, but we just want a part in the industry. These are Aboriginal products. These are part of our culture, and we just want to be recognised as the people who domesticated these plants. And you might think it's going to be easy, you know, that people, of course people will remember that Aboriginal people made these plants, but don't stand between a man and a dollar.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I think we probably need to leave it there just for time. Once again, thanks very much for a great presentation. Cheers. I forgot to mention Bruce is also a Richmond supporter, and unfortunately they went out last week in the finals, but my team Fremantle went out a long time ago at the start of the season, unfortunately. So that leads me to our second presenter, which is Gerry Turpin. Gerry's a man from North Queensland who's been employed by the Queensland State Government for about 30 years. Gerry's previously been involved in the Queensland Herbarium, vegetation surveys and regional eco-mapping project in Queensland. He currently manages the Tropical Indigenous Ethnobotany Centre at the Australian Tropical Herbarium, quite a mouthful all that, in partnership with the James Cook University, Department of Science, CSIRO, and has worked with many traditional owner groups on Cape York and on other parts of Queensland. Gerry is a member of the Ecological Society of Australia Board of Directors with the role of Indigenous Engagement, and a member of the NESP, Threatened Species Recovery Hub Indigenous Reference Group. In 2013, Gerry took out the first ever Science Award at the 2013 National Indigenous Awards for Best Scientist or Science Projects of the Year category. Quite an achievement. Please welcome Gerry to the podium to do his presentation, Working with Indigenous Biocultural Knowledge in Natural Resource Management. Thanks, Gerry.
Good morning. I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners from this area, and also traditional owners in the room as well, elders past and present. Unfortunately, I didn't get to come to the Welcome to Country yesterday. Jetstar left my luggage back in Cairns, so I had to hang around when they finally delivered it. So my talk is about, I'm going to start off with my country. As Indigenous people, it's about who we are and where we come from, and that sort of stems from when Aboriginal people were taken from their lands and taken to missions and reserves, and families were separated. And, you know, we're always looking for that connection, even today. Talk about the Ethnobotany Centre, Indigenous Biocultural Knowledge, what is biocultural knowledge, the potential for IBK, integrating IBK in projects, a little bit about Indigenous engagement, and then in a project example. My experience is more with plants, very limited in restoration, but yeah, I'll try and keep in line with the theme of the conference. That's Barbara, west of Herberton, the other side of the Great Dividing Range. That's my mother's side. On the right side, I also have links to Wajinbara Yidinji on the Atherton Tablelands, Nudgin, and also Kukataipan from the Cape, where one of my granddads come from. That's the recognised area, the Indigenous Land Use Agreements area, and native title is within that. Native title these days is drawn with a straight line. In the past, our borders were mountains and rivers and creeks, but that's how white people see our borders, as just straight lines in native title. It's a pretty big area, and people say, you know, wow, you got all this land and country there, but it's not as it's not as good as that, because we share that with pastoralists. Mining have rights before native title. We have other people have leases on there, leftover hippies from the 70s, squatters as well has taken up residence. So, and the land itself that we're given is pretty much the crap country that's been left over. It's a mining area, lots of old mine sites there. I think they've estimated over 1,000 abandoned mine sites. So, potential, you know, for rehabilitation projects on old mining sites. Our previous experience, as was mentioned, regional ecosystem mapping and vegetation surveys. My area was a channel country, and that was with the Queensland Herbarium, a statewide project, and the skills and experience that I gained from that, I take to the communities, and as part of a knowledge exchange to build their capacity to be able to manage their country. That's a ethnobotany centre housed within the Australian Tropical Herbarium behind the James Cook Uni campus at Smithfield there. In 2010, when I went back to be closer to home country, we established the Ethnobotany Centre, and we invited the traditional owners from around the area and other interested parties. And we just asked them, you know, what would they like in such a centre? And this is what they come up with. And it sort of represents that holistic nature of Indigenous knowledge, where everything is connected to something else. I can't mention plants without them mentioning law, customs, sacred stuff. And in the past, that's how everything was connected. You know, they had business enterprise, economy, as Bruce mentioned, justice. They had education and training, where the elders took young people out in country and taught them things, employment, health with they were very healthy people because they knew which foods to eat, and very knowledgeable about their plant medicines. And they saw other traditional owners groups just getting together, sharing and talking and helping each other in their ventures. I have an Indigenous working group, so it's the first Indigenous-driven centre in Australia. And I have an Indigenous working group who are there not as representatives of their clan groups, but they're there for their knowledge and experience in Indigenous matters. We also have a coordinating committee made up from our partners, and they manage the higher levels of mechanisms in government and universities, all that stuff that I don't have to deal with. And I work with many traditional owner groups, clan groups, individuals in North Queensland and other parts of Australia. The main aim of the centre is to record the knowledge, provide assistance to traditional owners in protecting, managing and maintaining the Indigenous biocultural knowledge. And you might recognise Poe there. She did a series. My cousin on the right there, that's my, he was Poe's cameraman. And so it was about his story coming back home to Yidinji country in one of the eel and turtle story places. It's important to note too that any information that I record is given back to the traditional owners, or if they haven't got the capacity to store it, I store it for them. Why is this recording and documenting IBK important? Elders are getting on, passing away, and the knowledge is being lost, so the elders want to keep it for the younger people when they're ready. You know, they're influenced by society as any young people, but it'll be there when they're ready. And the maintenance of Indigenous knowledge and cultural practice is becoming very urgent at the moment. That's Uncle Tommy George, Cooker Taipan elder, he was given an honorary doctorate for his knowledge in cultural burning, and it was fortunate that someone recorded his knowledge, and now that knowledge is being shared all over Australia with the National Indigenous Fire Workshop. Our activities are grouped into 4 themes as research. As I mentioned when I talk about plants, it's not just about plants, it branches off. You know, you get these tentacles reaching into other areas. So this one example was in Mackay with the Yugara and Quanjimal people, the shared country, and it was about putting in Indigenous values and perspectives into land planning. Usually they're left out of it when that sort of thing happens, but it was about them putting their knowledge and perspectives into the planning, but also they were concerned about the changes on their country, on Cape Palmerston, and they could see the changes, so we were able to share the Western view of climate change, and that helped them to prepare, you know, gave them ideas on how to prepare, because if sea level rise does happen, where do they go? Most of the country stands to be covered, and there's Indigenous groups up the back, so, you know, where do these people go when sea level rise does happen? Our medicinal plant project, in partnership with the National Institute of Complementary Medicine, Western Sydney University, and that was just about our medicinal plants getting analysed, and the community wanted to make natural medicines. We know they work, but the wider community wants scientific validation, so, and that's why we have this partnership with them, and that will bring economic benefit to our community. Training and education, as I mentioned, the National Fire Workshop. So it's important when you're burning that you know the plants of your country. So I just provide vegetation site data collection, plant collection training to other groups, weed identification, everything to do with plants. Talk with schools to promote science, promote you know, interest in science. Not many Indigenous kids, they look at science as a career, but it's changing now, and you know, kids are getting very interested now, and it's also about talking to them about, you know, what does a scientist look like? It's not the view of, you know, a person in the lab with a white coat. You know, they could look like me, you know, some dodgy person like me. Also, promoting Indigenous biocultural knowledge, and you know, at seminars and forum and conferences as well. Intellectual property protocols and agreements is a big topic up the north, so you know, we aim to become a leader in that area, to provide a better understanding for traditional owners on how to design effective and efficient free, prior and informed consent, and to get what they want out of things, basically. We're aware of the Convention on Biological Diversity, United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Nagoya Protocol and the Biodiscovery Act, and I'm also a member of the Indigenous Knowledge Forum in Sydney, and that's traditional owners, a bunch of lawyers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and they're working at the higher levels in government. I just want to elaborate a little bit about the Queensland Biodiscovery Act. Queensland was the first state to introduce biodiscovery legislation. There was a review of it, which we were involved in. Recommendations were made. It mentioned Indigenous people, but this doesn't give full protection. So some of the recommendations agreed in principle included implementing the Nagoya Protocol and developing a nationally consistent approach to access and benefit sharing. And the Nagoya Protocol was designed in Japan, and this is about the genetic resources. Nagoya applies on and after the 12th of October once it's implemented, and specimens collected before then are exempt. And collectors need to provide that they had traditional owner consent, written consent. They need to show that they have consulted right people for right country, as we say. And while Australia has not yet implemented, countries like Europe and Japan and Brazil are demanding proof of provenance for research specimens. So the museums and herbariums are getting on board with this now. And number 4, collation of existing data. And as you heard from Bruce, there's lots of information, hidden information, that you really have to search. And that's just taken out, that top one there, taken out of the Royal Society of Queensland Journal, 1907. And in there it had 5 plants with Umbarbarum names. We've only got 300 words left in our language, and any addition is very valuable to us. In the Cairns Museum, they have lots of artefacts in there, and they don't know what they are, where they come from, which group they come from. One of them was this fish hook, and they wanted to know what plant that was made of. And just looking through that database, it turned out it was Geranda jenkinsonia, a vine which grows very thick tendrils, and that tendril is cut off and shaped into a hook. And the string is probably made from the bark of a fig tree or a peanut tree or something like that. What is Indigenous biocultural knowledge? So you've heard the terms, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous ecological knowledge, and similar to that. But Indigenous biocultural knowledge is putting people back into the environment, and people and culture. So it's knowledge that encompasses people, language and culture and their relationship to the environment. Christie describes it as Aboriginal science, a mode of knowledge production which has evolved to allow human beings to fit into rather than outside of the ecology, so without the influence of Western science. And biocultural diversity describes a link between culture and diversity. Indigenous people have always felt that they've been, or have always said that they were part of the environment. They were never separate from it. And we have this separation, like national parks and World Heritage areas. And that's fine to understand. It needs to be protected. But what that means is Indigenous people, they can't practice culture, and they're kept out of it. So, and that's the problem that Indigenous people feel that they have. There's studies that show there's a direct link between cultural diversity, loss of cultural diversity, and the loss of biodiversity. And then similarly, where there are these biodiversity hotspots, that's where it's been managed in some way by Indigenous people. And you all know David Suzuki said Indigenous knowledge is critical for human survival, and he said that because he's been working with Indigenous people all over the world for about over 30 years. And some of the potential for Indigenous biocultural knowledge is fire management, just one of the popular ones, and that's been going on for a while now. Biodiversity monitoring and conservation, Indigenous people are out there on country, they're observing, they know what's happening, and they can provide assistance to researchers that are coming out on country. With climate change, as I said, Indigenous people are observing what's happening. They're indicator plants. You know what indicator plants are. When a plant flowers, it tells them that something else is happening. So the flowering of a K-pop might mean that the mullet is in prime condition and it's ready to eat. The flowering of a wattle might tell them that the crabs are ready. The bite of a marchfly tells them the crocodile eggs are ready to eat and to collect. But they're noticing that plants are flowering at different times now. The rains are coming at different times. And when the rains don't come at the right time, the scrub turkey doesn't lay its eggs. So it's sort of disrupting their food supply, if you like. Indigenous biocultural knowledge and food security. You heard about the native grasses being used, and one example is our native wild rice. It has valuable traits that could be bred into commercial rice, and that comes as a result of managing these plants, through climatic changes, environmental changes for thousands of years, without being tainted by other plants, particularly overseas. The aquatic systems, so lots of stories revolve around their lagoons and water systems, and that can inform the contemporary water management activities, including water allocation planning. In the myths, so-called myths and legends, in these historical events, for example, the coastal Yidinji people, they have stories where the elders in the tribe went out on a shelf out from Cairns and they walked to the nearby islands, and those stories exist in those legends, and scientists have researched it and found that the water level did in fact rise about 10,000 years ago. The old volcanoes, the stories talk about the earth opening up, fire and coming out, and the earth swallowing people up, and fire and brimstone, and then that's the volcanoes, extinct volcanoes that happen. Also, when I was talking about that story about the volcanoes, one of the elders said it wasn't rainforest previously; it was more like savanna. And recent research into nearby swamps with the pollen, they've identified pollen from savanna communities, and it's kind of confirmed that story as well. The story about the sea level rising, there's over a dozen similar stories around the coast of Australia that Indigenous people have. So in those stories, the historical events that can inform the historical aspect of Australia. Integrating this knowledge in restoration projects, as I said, my experience in that is limited, but what I've read is that incorporating Indigenous knowledge into restoration projects is still very limited. In Lord, they examined about 30 award-winning Australian restoration projects, and they identified that few projects had strong cultural components. There was a lack of information about Indigenous-led restoration projects, and even though there's a strong recognition of Indigenous association to the land, it was difficult to incorporate, and I agree with that. Sometimes it's difficult to work with Indigenous people into deciding exactly what each aims, and that sometimes it's different to what the science community wants. So Indigenous people have different aims and desires. And as I mentioned before, the other challenges are intellectual property and researchers' difficulty in connecting within Indigenous groups. And just a little bit about that engagement, the cultural interface. Nakada says this is where the two cultures come together, Indigenous knowledge experts and scientific or Western experts, and when they come together, that's where you work out the differences. That needs to be done first before you even start the project, so that trust is gained, friendship, and a good idea of what each other want in the project. Understanding and value both knowledge systems. Sometimes it helps to have a cultural broker who's got their feet in both worlds, and that's part of the work of the Ethnobotany Centre that I do. A lot of time, takes time, and then we ask researchers that they employ project officers, Indigenous people, in their research as well, so that it creates that relationship. This is one project that I was involved with, Cape Flattery Silicon Mine, owned by the Japanese, and they wanted to work with the local Indigenous people on their country, and to see what aims they had as well. Lots of dune area, dune heath and dune shrublands. The area was owned by, or the leases cover the Guga Yimita traditional owner clan groups areas, the Yura peoples. Dingao, Ngurumoru, Gungu, Tunil clan groups. The women were paid to collect the seeds, but extra seeds were collected. And the Gugayumita people wanted the focus to be on food and medicine plants. By the way, the word kangaroo comes from the Gugayumita language. It's mispronunciation, Angaru, something like that. So, but it's been mispronounced. And the Gugayumita people say that they're the ones that discovered Captain Cook, not the other way around. Dr. Fani Venter was engaged to manage the project, and then we got Uncle Bernie Hart, one of the local Indigenous groups, from one of the local Indigenous groups, to provide his knowledge was pretty amazing of all the plants and even the animals in that area. After they mined the area, they returned topsoil to assist in regeneration. Nursery built and the plants were grown. As we said, we collected extra seeds, and I recorded Uncle Bernie's knowledge as well. And we helped. Sometimes I do physical work, so I help in the nursery as well. And the flow-on benefits were, the environment was restored. The land was given back in an enhanced condition. As you all know, you can never restore the environment back to original condition, but it can be left in a better condition after it has been destroyed. Ongoing good relationship between the mine and the traditional owners. Lots of them are being employed in the mine now. And for the TOs, their bush tucker medicinal plants restored, knowledge recorded and documented. That knowledge was uploaded into the Miramar database, which anybody could access from the group. And that database is used at the Hopewell Primary School. And they have these sessions where they write songs using that information. And in cultural camps where they go out and collect plants, but they identify in language name and also scientific name. A business opportunity for tourism and the like as well. And thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Gerry, for a fantastic speech again. Is there any questions from the floor? Yeah, one up the back. Just while we're taking the microphone up the back, at last night's student night, we spoke about career development and the challenges for young students. Can you provide a bit of discussion about how being persistent has benefited things like the Ethnobotany Centre development?
In students? Yeah. They do show a lot of interest in science. There's a lot more students that are going on to grade 12 and passing and going on to university more than ever now. The problem with a lot of the communities is that it's very hard to leave community to go away, so that's the problem that they have, to leave their family. A friend of mine, you might know her, Amelia Innes, she has, with the group up in the Northern Territory, they've established a bush university, so they've taken university to the bush. So I think, that's what we need to look at when we want to include the more remote Indigenous communities.
Quick question, just about the involvement in land management, which we probably all like to think would be automatic, but you've identified a few barriers and things. Are you making any headway in getting an increase in that sort of involvement?
Yes, Indigenous people, as I said, they're concerned about what's happening, and they know they can see what's happening as well. And in the past, they've managed this country through thousands of years, and they had time, to manage that. But things are happening so quickly these days that they understand that they need Western science to come in and help. So my interest is also Indigenous knowledge and Western science working together to manage these problems. So they do like researchers coming in, as long as it's done in a respectful way. And there used to be a very, used to be distrustful of researchers, because in the past researchers came in, they got a couple of people to tick the box, they did their research, and then they went away, and no knowledge exchange. The community wasn't engaged, and then Indigenous people didn't know where, that research went to, and they had no idea of what was being done in their country. So while they're inviting researchers, they want to be included in the project as well, at every level.
Once again, please thank Gerry for his presentation. Our third and last speaker for this first session is Professor Bruce Clarkson. Bruce Clarkson is a restoration ecologist interested in habitat restoration to being Indigenous, bringing Indigenous nature back to cities, and he's based in Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. He leads a Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment funded research program, People, Cities and Nature, Restoring Indigenous Nature in Urban Environments. In 2016 he received the Royal Society of New Zealand Charles Fleming Medal for Environmental Achievements. He's also a board member of the Australasian Chapter of International Society for Ecological Restoration, on the governance group for Building Better Homes, Towns, Cities and National Science Challenge, and is an ambassador for the New Zealand's Biological Heritage National Science Challenge. He's also an All Black supporter, which is disappointing, but knowing Bruce, never shy to let me know. Please welcome Bruce to the podium to do his presentation, Balancing the Science and Politics of an Urban Ecological Restoration Project. Welcome, Bruce.
Right, well I've turned it on, so I think it's working. Kia ora tātou. First of all, can I please pay my respects to the mana whenua of this land, in our term, that Polynesian word for the original people of the land. My respects to you all. So I've already proven that my thesis, Balancing Science and Politics in an Urban Ecological Restoration Project, has not been achieved because I've arrived at the conference one day late. I arrived at the conference one day late because of a crucial meeting that occurred in Hamilton City Council yesterday. I'll tell you about that some other time. So where I come from, in the Waikato, as Vern has said, Hamilton City, well, we call it a city, but of course in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've really only got one city. The rest of them are really just small towns. 150,000 people, a city footprint of only 10,000 hectares, bisected by the largest river in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Waikato River. Some context for the work that we do in urban restoration. So we live in one of New Zealand's indigenous biodiversity deserts. This has been caused because of essentially the establishment of intensive dairying across our landscape. So in what we call the Hamilton Ecological District, 160,000 hectares, only 1.6% of the original vegetation remains. This is a biodiversity desert. Within our city footprint, about 2% of the vegetation across the city has some trace of native species within it. And across our agricultural landscape, we have 42 Queen Elizabeth II covenants, mean size 4.4 hectares, for a total of 185 hectares. All of this out of a total ecological district of 160,000 hectares. We've got a big job on our hand. So within our city, all of the remaining patches dominated by indigenous plants are extremely small. The mean patch size, 1.1 hectares, scattered across 67 key sites. And the images there, the one on the top left, is of our largest patch of indigenous forest remaining within our city, 5.2 hectares, dominated by the swamp tree Dacrycarpus. So we all know in Aotearoa, New Zealand, plenty about how you restore existing patches of native vegetation. It's a fairly standard recipe that occurs around the world It's about removing weeds and pests, buffering the patch, trying to expand it if possible and reconnect it with other patches. But in cities like the one where I live, Hamilton and Napier and Hastings and Christchurch, many of our Aotearoa New Zealand cities, that is not enough. We've actually got to start reconstructing or retrofitting new Indigenous habitat. And that is the task that myself and my team and many members of the community in Hamilton have taken on. We've taken on reconstruction. So that's moving beyond what I call revegetation planning, where you just pop a few trees in the ground, actually thinking clearly about what you're trying to achieve and re-establishing an ecosystem which is dominated by Indigenous species and provides habitat for all of the relevant fauna as well, and in our case, particularly for birds, native birds. So we focus on full assemblages and species occupancy, and in the words of Watson Featherston, the leader of the Caledonian Forest Recovery Program, we are trying to restart the clock, getting the Indigenous ecosystems back up and running, building habitat for all components of the ecosystem, and not just bringing back birds, as many of my New Zealand colleagues want to do. So we tend to use a natural successional framework for our planting. So that's simply, knowing what are the pioneer species in your flora, what are the species you bring in at mid-succession, what are the species that you bring later on in the process through processes of enrichment and enhancement planting to build back the full ecosystem. And taking up the challenge of the British ecologist Tony Bradshaw, the president of the British Ecological Society, who in 1983 put out the big challenge. The ultimate challenge for ecologists is to reconstruct ecosystems. Only when you can do that do you really understand their dynamics and functioning. So in Hamilton, the two areas that we largely concentrate our work on are these areas, this particularly important landform, the Hamilton Gully. So these are the tributaries, the small tributaries of that large river which runs through our city and bisects it. And they were formed about 5,000 years ago by a major geomorphological event caused because the Waikato River did a massive downcutting, and each one of these tributaries is formed by a process, geomorphological process known as spring sapping. All of these gullies literally contain every weed known to humankind. And so the big challenge in these places is how you take what some scientists would call a novel ecosystem and turn it into a useful ecosystem dominated by Indigenous species. And the traces that are left on the landscape are often merely reduced to mere words of mention on a map, reflecting some of the words I heard from Bruce Garry before. The Manga ko Tukutuku Gully, Manga ko Tukutuku being the Polynesian name for the native tree fuchsia. This is the last trace of what used to, this is the only way we know what used to be on the landscape and what our target might be. But more recently, we've put all of our energies into a new sort of park right on the edge of our city, which is called Waiwhakariki Natural Heritage Park. That word meaning Wai referring to water, the place where the Marco Polo was plunged into the water by the mana whenua of this land, a tribe by the name of Ngāti Wairere. So we've put our energies in here and we've developed a ecological restoration plan which is tuned into the landscape and the topography of a 60-hectare site, and I'm going to progressively start introducing some of the politics of the ecology as I work my way into this talk. So the different colour codes there, everything from ridgetop forests dominated by the big tree agathis, you have relatives here, the mid-slope forests with the Podocarpaceae and members of Lauraceae, and the semi-swamp forests down by the Little Peat Lake, which comprise things like Dacrocarpus, Laurelia, and Syzygium. These were the main trees that once covered what is now currently farmland and that we are progressively reconstructing back to give the full representative sequence of the different ecosystems types that characterise the whole of the Hamilton ecological district. The target at the bottom right is something to think about a little bit later on. That's a piece of public land adjoining the park, which was designated for subdivision. Public land designated for subdivision. I'll bring that up a little bit later. Anyway, so 60 hectares and the first tree planted in 2004, and as of this date, 33 hectares planted. This project was one of New Zealand's Millennium projects. So we have this incredible byline that was printed on our $10 commemorative note in the year 2000. And some of you may know that the sun rises first in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a mere artefact of a dateline, we know. But there is the image on the first day of the new millennium as the Polynesian waka sailed ashore and to mark the first daylight of the new millennium in Gisborne on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. And here was the $10 commemorative note that we produced, and we came up with a whole list of amazing projects, all of which were non-ecological and had no permanent remnant left on our political environment. And here was the byline. I have to read it to you. The dawn of a new era lights the way for New Zealand's perpetual voyage of discovery and innovation. If only, if only. So, anyway, not taking any notice of that byline, we pressed ahead. And here is the brief history of our project. I've been involved in the project since day one, 20 years. And what I'm going to tell you now is about what is the politics that you have to participate in to continue a project of this style. So luckily, this land had already been purchased by the city in 1975 as a land banking exercise by a previous mayor who understood that the city would grow and there was a need to provide for future recreation and green space. In 1998, an original joint venture proposal, this was the Millennium proposal from the local Polytechnic and the City Council, decided that this land would be a good place to construct a botanical living museum. And this received initial endorsement from the council. And of course you'll see here immediately the Botanical Living Museum. All of the restoration ecologists in the room were saying alarm bells, alarm bells, alarm bells. And of course we did then do something about it. So we got involved in the project and progressively turned it into an ecological restoration project. By 2004, the concept plans for the Natural Heritage Park had been approved, and as I said, the first tree was planted. And this had turned into a partnership between local government, the University of Waikato, the local Polytechnic, Tui 2000, which was an umbrella group for all of the environmental conservation groups in the city, and most importantly, Ngāwana Tupu or Kirikiriroa, which represented the mana whenua of the land, the people who had the original heritage on this land. And at this stage, the proposal included a 5.1 hectare eco subdivision. 2011, the operative management plan was ratified. As it is recently, this is the picture you get nowadays. June 2016 at our Arbor Day planting, 1,800 people turned up, 28,000 plants were put in the ground, 3 hectares was planted in 3 hours. Of course it sounds great, but think about the 2 days that went into the planning and the laying out of the plants and all of the planning that needs to go. It's like a military operation to get that 3 hectares planted in 3 hours. And of course we have target ecosystems. We work towards the concept of a target ecosystem. This is the alluvial plains forest that we're trying to reconstruct. And just again to help you with the Polynesian names there, particularly Kakatia dacrocarpus, Pukatia laurelia, swamp mire syzygium, and of course all of the things that used to live in this target ecosystem on the alluvial plains. So the Google Earth view of what's been going on, 2004, grazing land, intensive agriculture, progressively remove the grazing animals and start the planting process, and by 2018, 33 hectares in place already. And of course, being an ecologist, when I first started in this project, this was all I was interested in, the ecology of the system and what you could learn from an exciting experiment like this, a natural experiment, if you like. And we've produced numerous papers and reports, my urban ecology team, some of whom are in the audience today. We've looked at species filters and trays, we've worked on species richness and regeneration, we've looked at cover richness, enrichment planting, seed banks, seed rain, you name it, we've had a go at the lot. But you know what? In the end, none of this project would have survived if it wasn't for the politics of it and our involvement in the politics to ensure that the process continued on. So just one example of some of the research results. Of course, we've used this to understand the critical thresholds in re-establishing forest in an urban environment. And this simply is a couple of simple graphs, really simple graphs, showing how the herbaceous cover declines over an 8-year period. And on the right-hand side, more importantly, when does the forest start regenerating? When does it start reproducing? When do the seed and the propagules come from the plants that you put in the ground? So in order to maintain all of this, we've also done operational science, obviously. So we have established a permanent monitoring network, and we do essentially a form of adaptive management where we learn from what we've planted, what the survival rates are, what works and what doesn't. And the dots there are just the permanent plots that we use for this monitoring network. And as the planting has spread across the landscape, we have progressively added new dots and new permanent monitoring sites. We've also developed a GIS planting tool where every polygon where we do the planting, we have it all now in a GIS and a database, and we can do all of our ordering of plants on the basis of, what is the composition of the different habitat we're trying to create, where can we find the seed, what numbers do we need, do the forward ordering, and understand how the whole system is working. And again, using an adaptive management process to inform what we do the next time we set out to plant our next 3 hectares. Now, getting into a bit of the politics. One thing we found out is that traditional news media is a complete waste of time, because what they tend to do in all newspapers in Aotearoa New Zealand, I'm sure they do it in your country too, is they focus entirely on the negative. And what's the big story of the day? Who murdered somebody in the local suburb? Who got run over? Whatever. And the really important things that build social cohesion and growth in society tend to get overlooked. And so, yes, we've had the history somewhat recorded in the traditional news media. We've had the ups and the downs. The one on the right is me holding up the pen from the original signing of the MOU with the City Council, reminding them of what they'd signed in 2004 and how they were not meeting their obligations. So that one possibly had a bit of an impact. And then more recently, the good news stories around our program is finally the Hamilton City Council is starting to step up to the mark and has now provided us with the funding, not only to help continue with the planting, but to properly open the park to the public by providing facilities like parking, toilets, entranceway, all of that sort of stuff. The point I wanted to make is that while the traditional news media does document things, it doesn't help you in getting the job done. And this is the main way that we've got the job done. We've got 2 Facebook sites. The one at the top is called Defend Waiwhakariki. Defend against whom? Against local politicians who make arbitrary decisions whenever a budget is being developed. So the one at the top is the one where we call people to account, where we mobilise people for meetings, where we gather the flash mob for the critical meeting where they're going to have the vote on what they're going to do. And then the one below is the one that we use for essentially telling the good stories of how the park is operating. The critical importance of the Defend Waiwhakariki website I cannot overstate. It's the one that has kept this project going in the last 10 years. And of course we've done all of the things. I was listening to Bruce making comments about making endless submissions. Well, we've done it too. Every annual plan for the last 14 years we've fronted up. Every long-term plan we've fronted up. Every structure plan, every integrated catchment management plan, every related regional plan, and most importantly, any special hearing, and I will come back now to the 5.1 hectare. So the 5.1 hectare, the original eco subdivision proposal, was canned by the council, and they suddenly decided, because of a financial shortfall, which I'm going to show you on a graph shortly, that we would sell the 5.1 hectares to raise some money to keep the budgets of the council going. And of course that oft misquote, and this is a misquote at the bottom, but it's quite a useful quote, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. Nothing could be truer than for this project than that last statement. So here's my little analysis of the political situation. You see, the point here is that politics is another form of ecosystem, and all the things that we study and learn in natural ecosystems apply to political ecosystems. And as they taught me in the army when I was conscripted, the first lesson was know your enemy. Well, actually not quite your enemy, but you need to systematically study the political ecosystem in order to succeed in it. Don't cross the boundary, don't join the dark side, but study them and understand them and use it. You must use that information. So here's the analysis of the terms of the different councillors that have been relevant, I should say the different mayors relevant to our project, nicely colour-coded so you can see how good they were for the environment, right? So the first ones, unfortunately, both defeated are the people who signed off on the project. They're a pale green because they didn't really want to support it, but the numbers were against them on the council. And then the next two, and this is the irony of this project. It will emerge in one of my future slides. These guys with the big bright green, they were the big supporters. They did everything possible to get this project going. But as we will find out shortly, they also did some other things which were very unwise. And then our 34th mayor, who had 2 terms, Julie. I'll just call her Julie for now. Notice that it was the browny orange colour at first. She was the one that got the vote, got into the position on the basis of, yeah, I'm an environmental supporter, and then progressively revealed her true colours. Right, and then she gets my red, right, the big red for the second term. And now the current mayor, Andrew, I've given him a very pale green because he's the guy that eventually signed off the funding for the opening of the park, but he only did it under major pressure and duress. So I'm waiting to see how he's going to develop in the future. Hey, please don't report any of this back to Hamilton City. Right. Here we are again. Here's the ecosystem you have to understand, because politicians only think in the short term, the 3-year term of the council. And here's my little graph of their retention or turnover. It could be a biodiversity variable, couldn't it? See the change in the council through time. You start out, then you have a big turnover, and then you have a solidifying and an evening out, and then there's another turnover. Well, you know what? For your project to succeed, you've got to be in their ear at particular points in time, and you know what those points in time are. When that transition occurs, have you gone out and got hold of them and led them by the hand as you did when you first started the project to explain to each and every one of them its significance? You've got to re-educate them. And I use the term in the pejorative sense there, to re-educate them. And so that's what we've been doing. And you also need to identify who are your supporters, who are the people who will really look after you in the long term. And I've named the biggest supporter of all, the 5-term councillor who stood behind the project from its inception to the day at which she retired. And you also have to identify the enemy, as I said. The enemy, the 3-term opponent, who turned the discussion into the greedy greenie who wanted to prevent the sale of public land to a private subdivider? I don't think so. Where's the greed lie? It doesn't lie with the greedy greenie. And the one who characterises the project as protecting bugs and slugs over humans, right? Let's get our values right here. Anyway, the point is, this is the sort of analysis that needs to be undertaken, and this is the work